Welcome to Next Time podcast. My name is Sundar. I lead the forensic services at Next Time. This podcast is part of Global Anti-Corruption series. Our podcast is an endeavor to bring up emerging topics of relevance for executives across spectrum of services we offer. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Across the geographies, regulatory environments are changing, business practices are changing, and behaviors are changing with COVID. Anti-corruption in the current times is bringing newer dimensions with issues around supply chain, healthcare, and other regulatory reporting requirements. This also extends to enforcements from the regulatory side and the whole new virtual world that we are experiencing at this point in time. In this podcast series, we will be interviewing specialists across regions to gather specific insights on anti-corruption in current times. The region that we would cover today is China. Today we have with us Brian. Brian is the head of Shearman's Asia Litigation and Investigation Practice. He has conducted investigations in China, Hong Kong, and other Asian countries. He is a fluent Mandarin speaker. He focuses on advising multinationals with operations in China in the areas of FCPA, anti-corruption, compliance, and in the other investigation matters. Brian, welcome to the show.
My pleasure to be here, thanks.
Brian, of course, over the past few months, there's a lot of things that have changed in China specifically. And the risk environment, the whole landscapes may have changed significantly. How do you see the corruption perceptions have changed in the current environment with the context of China?
Well, China is a complex market, and when it comes to corruption, I would say the risks can always be described as elevated. Even before the coronavirus pandemic, the risks of corruption in China are elevated. That means that companies need to be extra vigilant when it comes to compliance, and particularly anti-corruption in China. But that environment, that elevated environment of risk, has only increased. So you have basically what's an elevated environment of risk on top of an already elevated environment of risk. So it's double. And I think now the reasons for that are threefold. First, you have the COVID-19 pandemic. There's no question that has caused significant disruption in China. Around the world, certainly, but we're talking about China now. The pandemic has affected China the longest. If you think about the origins of the pandemic, there's a lot of discussion and debate about where the pandemic or where the virus originated. It's really not relevant to the conversation of compliance. What is relevant is that the pandemic has been in China, or the coronavirus has been in China longer than any other country. So you have a prolonged exposure to a massive market and healthcare crisis. The second is the disruption that is caused as a result of that. China is a supply source for the world. And we've seen this for the past 15, 20, 30 years. And China has been supplying the world. It has major exports around the world. China has also been a consumer. And in the past 10 years, its role as a worldwide consumer has increased. So now China is a two-way market, but it's the supply chain where the risks are the greatest, because that's where the disruption has happened the most. We saw this in, I think, probably the clearest way with the personal protective equipment. When the world was, in the past few months, going through the pandemic, the need to have personal protective equipment was elevated, increased, and urgent around the world. The supply chain for most of that personal protective equipment comes from China, and yet China had its own crisis within its borders. That creates competition in a crisis. A crisis is bad by itself, but when you have competition for resources in a crisis, it becomes even more acute.
It's an opportunity for misconduct, corruption, practically.
Almost an incentive.
Almost an incentive, yeah. It's more like a business incentive in that sense.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're looking at people who are trying to make money in a normal environment. Everybody's, needs to be mindful that companies need to make money to pay their employees. Employees need to make money to feed their families and to live. And when you have a situation like we're in the past 6 months, the incentive and the opportunity to engage in corruption is extremely high. And as I said earlier, that's extremely high on top of an already elevated. It's like building a house on top of a mountain. It's even higher altitude of risk.
Brian, that was a very interesting point to reflect upon how the risks are very elevated in the current context in a complex market like China. You did definitely mention about supply chain as a key risk. Are you seeing any other risks that have emerged out of COVID-19, specifically in the context of anti-corruption?
Yes, unfortunately we are. This is happening around the world, and I think it's happening in a very acute sense in China, and that's people taking advantage of a crisis. It's really hard to watch, but when a crisis occurs, there are people who take advantage of the disruption, of the urgency for urgency for medical attention, but also urgency for resources. And what we're seeing in China is, for instance, fake charities being set up. We're seeing scams, people and companies that are being established to take money as if they're helping the crisis, but it's actually just a scam to make money. We see fake medical treatments, which is just extraordinarily difficult from an ethical perspective. It's really difficult to see this happening. But it's better to be aware of it than to ignore it. So while you may not want to think about it or talk about it, the people abusing, exploiting a crisis.
Absolutely. And some of the things that you're mentioning specifically impacts those organizations which are actually funding for these healthcare expenses. They may be funding a certain amount of money for healthcare expenses as a noble cause, and there could be corruption issues associated with it. That's a matter of concern that organizations which are investing in such exercises may need to be aware of in terms of conducting due diligences and things like that. Is that what you're reflecting on?
Yeah, I think it's the two things. It's that the types of companies that we're just talking about now, and it's also third parties that are required for doing business. The companies,
absolutely,
yeah, third parties are always a higher risk, and when you add any addition of a third party increases the opportunity, the risk of corruption, and it does so in a one-to-one relationship. So you add one more third party, it's one more risk. And when the environment is under such strain as it is now,
severe stress,
severe stress, and that each third party becomes a risk in and of itself. But on the other hand, you can't do business without third parties, particularly in these industries where you have supply chain and where you have healthcare in particular, which is known and requires a distribution chain, not only a supply chain, but a distribution chain to be successful. That means that third parties are required.
Absolutely. One of the things that I wanted to extend from the pointers that you mentioned is that there is also a lot of changes that have happened over this past few months, so to say, at least from China's perspective, is there is a lot of government touch points that would have increased, either for contact tracing or for issues associated with even Medicare, looking at the way the pandemic spreading altogether. How do you see the impact of the government touch point and the implications of corruption associated with that?
Well, that's an interesting question. Definitely, there have been increased touch points with the government, and each time you have a touch point with the government, there's a risk of corruption. But also you have what's a very interesting thing happening at the same time, which is that people are reluctant to visit each other. And whereas in a culture like China, where face-to-face interactions, social interactions, having tea with somebody or having a meeting that happens before or after a meal. Those types of things are necessary. They're the sort of the lubricant that makes the culture work in China. That element of person-to-person interaction has changed because of the pandemic. And so while you would say, for instance, you have a visit from a government official, or you pay a visit to a government official, or in the healthcare industry in particular, you're visiting hospitals and doctors. And under some legal regimes, a state-owned hospital and a doctor who works at a state-owned hospital might be considered a government official because it's state-owned under the FCPA. That's the theory. So you would think that, well, if you're interacting more with government officials, including doctors, the increase of corruption risk goes up. However, people are reluctant to go to hospitals, to meet with doctors. The government has put restrictions on the amount of people that can go into hospitals. Government has put, even before the pandemic, the government has put restrictions on, for instance, sales representatives, medical reps of pharma and medical device companies visiting hospitals. Now, hospitals, you don't want hospitals to be visited by sales reps because the hospitals themselves are urgent crisis care centers. And so I think actually the amount of government touch points is probably not as significant an increase in the risk as the disruption in the supply chain that we talked about, and also the loss of revenue and sales. Loss of revenue and sales is what most people are going to be concerned about once the health crisis has passed. And still, China is a bit ahead of the rest of the world because it's gone through the waves.
They've had an impact for many months now. Compared to the other parts of the world.
And now what's going to be the focus is how to recover financially, economically, how the Chinese economy, which is one of the largest in the world, a very powerful engine, how the Chinese economy can recover from this crisis. And I'm concerned about that too, because as people has loss of sales and loss of revenue and disruption in the supply chain, there's a chance that people may be cutting corners or trying to keep their profits, trying to preserve profits. And one way to do that is through corruption, bribery, and fraud.
That's an interesting point that you alluded to even before when we were actually speaking in the initial conversation. Now, while you see that there's going to be a risk that's going to come upon primarily because of the economic incentives each of the businesses would have in attempting to achieve their targets and balance their supply chain and then move on with the economic progress. From the crisis scenario that they are in, how do you see regulatory agencies looking at it, and how do you look at enforcement actions on these?
Well, I think there will be increased enforcement, but I don't think it will come now. I think it will come after the storm has passed. Right now, rightfully, governments, regulators, agencies are appropriately focused on stemming the flow, on managing the crisis. We are still seeing some enforcement actions, particularly from the US. There have been a couple of enforcement actions that were announced recently, but those were in the pipeline. And sometimes people look at the news and they say, oh, there was a big FCPA announcement or UK Bribery Act or something like that. And that means enforcement risks are high currently in the crisis. Actually, if there's anything announced now that was clearly going on for several months, if it's a corruption or bribery enforcement action, what I think we'll see is a dip in enforcement as a result of the regulatory focus on a dip in enforcement in the anti-corruption area as a result of regulatory emphasis and focus on stemming the damage from the crisis. Then I think we're going to see a long tail of enforcement, almost like the financial crisis in the United States in 2008, 2009. Yeah, the bottom was dropping out of the market. And then it was followed by 10 years of aggressive enforcement, insider trading, securities fraud, white collar. Some people say that it's still going on, and some people say that the enforcement wasn't enough in the United States. In China and in other markets around the world, I think the increase in enforcement we have yet to see. I think it will happen in 2021, in 2022. Once the crisis gets under control and there's a vaccine for the coronavirus, then I think the world will say, okay, now the pandemic is under control. Now we have to, now the dust has settled and we have to clean up. And that's when the enforcement, I think, will happen.
Absolutely, I can't agree more, Brian, on this particular point. I think the priorities are also very, very clear for regulators at this point in time. More efforts and energies are going towards the healthcare system per se. But that's not going to be the scenario for compliance officers. They can't wait till the enforcement kicks off, and they are in a position where many of the compliance officers that I've had conversations with in the past 60 to 90 days have expressed concerns around maintaining compliance activities, because at this point in time you cannot control what a business leader says, because the business leader understands that there's crunch of revenue, and they're looking to pursue that revenue, and how it gets interpreted by the down the line staff is also something that will be very difficult to comprehend. So in this crisis kind of a scenario, in a market like China, what do you have as suggestions for compliance officer?
Compliance officers might even be able to use this as an opportunity to increase resources. The crisis does give an opportunity for departments, legal and compliance departments, to express to leadership that the risks are higher, and anytime that risks have increased, so too resources need to increase for the company's efforts to mitigate those risks. And that's what the legal and compliance departments are there for. I often hear compliance officers complain about, we are looked at as a cost center, not a profit center. And so the business people say, well, why should we spend more on compliance? It's not earning us any money. When a crisis happens, the company needs to get into protection mode. And that's where compliance officers can say, we are a protection department. We're in the business of protecting the company from risk. Same thing with legal departments. The other area where I think compliance officers should be focusing on is training. With this remote workforce, and particularly in China, where the workforce is spread out across a very large country and is not always office-based to begin with. And take, for example, the healthcare industry. You have a workforce and the sales reps that are spread out all over the country of China, and they're not tied to a desk. So this movement to a remote working environment is not very new in the Chinese, for instance, the Chinese healthcare market, where a large portion of the workforce was already working remotely. The opportunity that compliance officers should take advantage of now is to conduct training. All kinds of tools are now available to Zoom and WebEx, and Tencent and Alibaba have tools now as well. WeChat. There are so many different avenues to communicate with your employees that compliance officers should be using every one of those avenues to conduct training and to solicit feedback from the workforce. Solicit feedback that you're not going to get from walking down the hall, because your people are not in the office in the way that they were before. So training and feedback has to happen virtually now. But that's, I think that's an opportunity to say, well, we need to use these channels to promote compliance. Now that's true more than ever.
Absolutely, Brian. And it's interesting to note what you mentioned with regard to how the Chinese see crisis as a combination of danger and opportunity, and a couple of points that you mentioned specifically from a compliance officer's point of view of enhancing resources and also increasing the training are very, very relevant pointers in that context. I really appreciate you joining and providing your perspectives on this. I look forward to connecting with you soon again. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.